The upstairs bedroom had been quiet, just the sound of boots on creaking boards and the slow sweep of a flashlight. But when the K9 slid halfway under the bed, he didn't come back out. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He just stared at something in the dark. When she knelt to look, her beam caught a piece of paper taped to the slats, a child's drawing of a house, a dog, and a shadow in a window. And in the corner, in shaky block letters, were the words, "He is in here." "There's space behind here," she said. Harris straightened, scanning the wall. Old houses like this sometimes had crawl spaces between rooms. "Or hiding spots," she replied. He left to grab a pry bar from the hall, his boots echoing in the emptiness. She stayed in the room with Rook, the dog's eyes locked on that seemed like it was a doorway. The house seemed to get quieter. Even the faint creak of shifting wood stopped. When Harris returned, Rook's ears pricked, but his gaze never left the wall. Harris positioned the bar at the baseboard. "Ready?" She nodded, hand on Rook's collar. The wood gave a groan as it pulled free. Cold air rushed out, sharper now, carrying with it a scent she couldn't quite place, metallic, damp, and unsettlingly familiar. Rook stiffened. Something was back there. The farmhouse had the kind of silence that made you hold your breath without realizing it, thick, layered, and settled like dust over years of abandonment. Each step across the warped wooden floorboards gave a low groan, as if the house itself was irritated at being disturbed. The smell was a blend of stale air, mildew, and something faintly metallic, like old nails left to rust in the damp. Rook, the black K9, moved ahead of her in a slow, steady pattern. His paws were almost soundless on the floor, his head low, nose skimming along the surface. The morning's light barely reached the upstairs hallway, filtered through narrow windows coated in grime. Somewhere behind them, Harris's voice carried faintly as he cleared the far rooms. It had been 42 hours since Molly Weaver, 8 years old, was last seen. Her trail had been erratic, boot prints in the mud that turned into bare feet, then vanished near the edge of the woods. The farmhouse wasn't on the search grid initially, but a neighbor's story about seeing a dark figure leading her this way made it worth checking. The second bedroom on the right looked like every other room they'd been through, stripped bare, a skeletal mattress frame without bedding, curtains that sagged and surrendered to gravity. She lingered in the doorway, sweeping her flashlight across the walls. No photographs, no furniture worth salvaging. Just another empty space. But Rook didn't leave. The K9 padded into the room, bypassed the empty dresser, and went straight to the bed frame. He lowered himself, sniffed once along the wood, then dropped his chest flat against the floor. His body shifted forward until half of him had disappeared into the shadows under the bed. She expected him to sniff around, maybe back out with a stray scrap of fabric or a lost toy. But he didn't move. "Rook?" Her voice was quiet but edged with curiosity. No response, not even an ear flick. She stepped closer, crouching. "What is it, boy?" That was when she noticed his posture, not the restless shifting of a dog chasing a scent, but the stillness of one locked onto something he couldn't ignore. She angled her flashlight down, letting the beam slice through the gloom. Dust swirled in the air like tiny, weightless snowflakes. The light caught the underside of the bed slats, and something pale stood out against the dark wood, a piece of paper, taped neatly to the frame. Her chest tightened. Leaning further, she brought the beam to bear on the paper. It was a drawing, pencil and crayon, smudged and faint in some places, heavier in others. A simple house, drawn with crooked lines. A stick-figure dog, its body colored black. In one of the windows of the house, a figure shaded so darkly it looked like a hole in the paper. And in the bottom corner, in uneven block letters, were the words, "He is in here." The letters were slightly shaky, unevenly spaced, as though written in a hurry, or with small, trembling hands. Behind her, boots thudded in the hallway. Harris appeared in the doorway, shotgun at a low ready. "Find something?" She didn't move her eyes from the paper. Yeah. You need to see this. Harris stepped inside, leaning down beside her. His gaze narrowed. How long you think that's been here? She shook her head. The paper's not yellowed much. Could be recent. Rook finally backed out, his body tense, tail low but wagging just slightly, the kind of motion that wasn't joy, but readiness. His gaze flicked from the drawing to the wall behind the bed, then back again. Harris reached under, carefully peeling the paper away from the slats. The tape cracked softly, dry with age, but the drawing itself felt too clean for something forgotten. This doesn't feel like it's been here for years, he said. She slid an evidence sleeve from her bag, holding it open while he slipped the drawing inside. Her fingers brushed the paper, feeling the faint ridges left by the crayon. If this is Molly's, she trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Rook sniffed the empty space where the drawing had been, then turned toward the wall at the head of the bed. His nose pressed against the narrow seam between the floor and the wall, breathing deeply, before he backed away with a short, almost impatient whine. She placed her hand near the seam. A faint current of cold air leaked through. Harris wedged the pry bar deeper into the seam. The old wood protested with a drawn-out groan, nails shrieking as they were torn free from decades of stillness. The sound seemed too loud in the hush of the house, each creak and pop echoing through the upstairs hallway. Rook didn't flinch at the noise. His focus was pinned on the widening gap in the wall, his head angled slightly, nose working in quick bursts as if trying to pull the scent straight into his memory. His breathing had changed, shorter, sharper draws, the kind that meant the smell was strong. The baseboard came away in a splintering crack. Cold air poured out in a thin stream, cutting against the warmer, stale air of the room. It carried with it something harder to define, a faint trace of damp soil, dust, and something metallic. She caught Harris's eye. You smell that? He nodded grimly. Blood. The words settled between them like a stone. Harris adjusted his grip on the pry bar, sliding it under the edge of the paneling above the baseboard. He gave a sharp tug. Another piece of wood tore loose, revealing a dark, narrow space between the bedroom wall and the outer shell of the house. Her flashlight beam cut into it, revealing rough, unfinished boards and clumps of insulation. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than dead space, the kind of hollow left from old, uneven construction. But as she swept the beam upward, something caught the light. A scrap of fabric, pale against the shadows, snagged on a nail. Rook's tail stiffened, the tip twitching. She leaned closer, careful not to put her face too near the opening. That's not just insulation. Harris crouched beside her, squinting. Looks like shirt material. Small, she murmured. Kid-sized. She reached in with gloved fingers, gently working the fabric loose from the nail. It came free with a faint rip, a torn piece of light pink cotton, frayed at the edges and faintly stained. She turned it over in her hand. The stain wasn't fresh, but the rusty brown color was unmistakable. Blood, she said quietly. Rook let out a low, throaty sound, not quite a growl, more a sound of readiness. He stepped forward, pressing his nose toward the opening again, sniffing deep. Then, without warning, he pawed at the edge, nails scraping against the wood. He wants in, Harris said. Which means something's in there, she replied. The opening was too narrow for either of them to fit through, at least without removing more paneling. Harris set the pry bar aside and began working the edge of the next board. The nails resisted, groaning as they were pried from the old studs. When the second board came loose, the gap widened enough to see deeper into the cavity. Her flashlight beam reached further this time, revealing the crawlspace stretched along the length of the wall, no more than 2 feet wide, the floor covered in dust and small debris. Something glinted faintly at the far end. Shine your light straight down, she told Harris. He adjusted the beam. The object was half buried in dust, a small, round button, red and glossy. Beside it lay another scrap of pink fabric. She felt her chest tighten. That's the same fabric. Rook's head shifted, his gaze darting between them and the gap, muscles tense like he was waiting for a signal. All right, Harris said, his voice low. We need to clear this space. They worked quickly, pulling free more boards until the gap was wide enough to kneel and lean in. The air was colder inside, like the space connected to some unsealed vent or open cavity. It smelled heavier now, dust, damp wood, and that faint metallic tang. Rook didn't wait for permission. The instant the last board came free, he dropped to his belly and began crawling in. Rook, she called softly, reaching for his harness. But he was already moving forward, his tail vanishing into the shadows. She and Harris exchanged a look, then she followed, leaning into the narrow gap. The flashlight beam bounced off the boards as she crawled forward on her elbows, the dust stirring up in faint clouds that made her throat itch. Halfway in, she spotted something on the right-hand wall, faint marks etched into the wood, barely visible until the beam caught them at an angle. She stopped, brushing away the dust with her glove. They were scratches, small, shallow grooves in clustered patterns, like someone had dragged their fingernails down the surface. Her stomach turned. Harris, she called, her voice just above a whisper. These are fresh. He was right behind her, wedged into the space. You sure? She angled the light. The raw wood beneath the marks was lighter than the surrounding surface, untouched by years of dust. Positive. Ahead, Rook stopped. His head was low, his nose nearly touching the floor, tail straight behind him. He gave a single, sharp exhale, then turned his head slightly, looking at something against the far wall. She crawled the last few feet, Harris right behind her. The far wall had a narrow vertical seam, almost invisible if you weren't looking for it. In the dust at the base, there was a faint outline, the kind left by something recently moved. It's a door, Harris murmured. Her pulse quickened. And it's been opened. Rook's eyes never left the seam. The seam in the far wall looked almost like a trick of the light, a faint, uneven line running from floor to ceiling, just wide enough to hint at something beyond. In the dust along its base, there was a shallow impression, as if the wall had been pushed inward and then pulled shut again. Rook's body was rigid, every muscle taut. His head shifted slightly from side to side, his ears flicking forward and back. He gave a low, controlled whine, not impatience, but urgency. She leaned closer, resting one gloved hand against the wood. The boards were cold. Not just cool from the crawlspace air, this was colder, like the surface of a door that led to somewhere unheated and unwelcoming. Harris wedged himself beside her, his flashlight beam running along the seam. This wasn't built with the original frame. You can see where they cut into the studs. Her eyes tracked the faint saw marks, visible beneath layers of dust. So someone made this after the house was abandoned? Or right before, Harris said. Either way, they didn't want anyone knowing it was here. Rook pawed at the base, claws scraping softly. She caught his collar. Easy, boy. We'll get it open. The problem was there was no obvious handle or latch. The boards were flush with the surrounding wall, save for that faint line. Harris pressed his fingertips along the seam, tapping lightly. The sound changed near the center, a duller thud that suggested a hollow space behind. That's our spot, he murmured. He slipped a thin pry tool from his belt and began working it into the gap. The wood resisted at first, but after a few patient seconds, it gave with a faint pop. Dust drifted down in the narrow beam of her flashlight. The panel didn't swing open like a normal door. Instead, it shifted inward slightly, then slid sideways along a hidden track with a gritty scraping sound. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to fit through sideways. The air that poured out was colder still, and thicker, stale in a way that made the back of her throat itch. It carried a scent that was sharp and metallic, undercut by something sour. Rook's nose was already in the gap, inhaling in deep, quick pulls. His tail was still, his head angled forward. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and stepped up beside the opening. "On me," she told Harris. They went in low, shoulders brushing the narrow frame. The space beyond opened into a small, square chamber, maybe 8 feet across, walls and ceiling covered in raw, unpainted boards. The only light came from their flashlights, the beams cutting through dust so thick it looked like smoke. In the far corner, a stack of boxes leaned against the wall. Beside them, a child-sized blanket lay rumpled on the floor, pale blue with faded cartoon animals. Her breath caught. Harris. He was already moving toward it, crouching low. He touched the blanket, then lifted it to his nose. "Fresh," he said. "Not warm, but she's been here recently." Rook circled the blanket, nose working. Then he froze again, head snapping toward the wall opposite the door they'd entered. She followed his gaze. The wall there was different, smoother boards, and in the center, a single piece of paper tacked to the wood. She crossed the room quickly, reaching for it. The paper was another drawing, done in the same shaky crayon lines as the one under the bed. This one showed the same house, but now there was no dog in the yard. The dark figure in the window was bigger. In the lower right corner, a new message was scrawled, "He comes at night." She felt the hairs along her neck lift. This is the same kid. Harris glanced over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. And she's leaving notes for someone to find. Or warnings, she said. Rook moved to the far corner and pressed his nose to the floor. He began pawing at a spot near the baseboard, claws scraping against wood. A hollow sound answered each strike. She knelt beside him, pressing her palm flat to the boards. "There's space under here." Harris swept his flashlight around the edges of the floor, finding a small metal ring set flush with the wood. He hooked a finger through it and gave a sharp pull. A square section of floor lifted, hinged at one side, revealing a dark hole that dropped into pitch blackness. The smell from below was stronger, colder, heavier, laced with damp earth. Rook's ears pricked forward, his gaze locked on the opening. His tail gave a slow, tense wag. "Basement access," Harris said. "Not on the house plans," she replied. They crouched at the edge, shining their beams down. The light fell on rough stone walls, the floor lost in shadow. The ladder leading down was old, the wood worn smooth in the center from use. Harris glanced at her. "We going in?" She hesitated. The scent coming up from below was making her skin prickle, not from fear, exactly, but from the deep certainty that whatever was down there was the reason Molly had left those drawings. Rook didn't wait for their decision. He stepped forward and planted both front paws on the first rung of the ladder, looking back over his shoulder as if to say now. She exhaled slowly. "All right, boy. Let's see what's waiting for us." The beam from her flashlight vanished into the darkness below, swallowed almost immediately. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the basement itself resisted being seen. The old ladder creaked under the weight of her boots as she started down, Rook waiting until she was only a few steps ahead before following, his paws finding each rung with the same surety as a seasoned climber. Harris brought up the rear, his flashlight angled over her shoulder. The air grew colder the deeper they went, the dampness clinging to her skin. Somewhere below, water dripped in slow, steady intervals, the sound distant but sharp, like droplets falling into a hollow space. Her boots touched the packed earth at the bottom. The ground was uneven, sloping slightly toward the far side where the shadows were thickest. The walls were rough stone, fitted together without mortar, their surfaces slick with condensation. The smell was stronger down here, soil, old wood, and that metallic tang she'd noticed upstairs. Rook stepped past her, his nose low, sniffing in tight, focused bursts. His breathing was quick but controlled, ears forward. He moved toward the far wall, his steps almost silent on the dirt. She swept her flashlight across the room. This wasn't a proper basement, it was more of a pit, crudely dug, the ceiling so low she had to stoop in some places. Wooden beams stretched overhead, some cracked and sagging. Harris crouched beside the ladder, his light catching on a pile of objects against the nearest wall. "Looks like storage," he murmured. They approached slowly. The pile wasn't random junk, it was deliberate. A small wooden crate filled with glass jars, each sealed but cloudy from age. Next to it, a tin lunchbox with faded paint, the clasp rusted shut. And then she saw it, another piece of paper, folded in half, tucked under the edge of a jar lid. She slipped it free and opened it. The crayon lines were rushed this time, jagged. A stick figure of a child stood beside the same dark figure from the earlier drawings, but now the figure's arm reached out toward the child. Above them, a crescent moon hung in the corner of the paper. Beneath it, written in large, uneven letters, was, "He comes down here." Her grip on the flashlight tightened. "She's been here," she said softly. Rook gave a sharp, single bark, not loud, but enough to echo off the stone walls. He was at the far side of the basement now, nose pressed against another seam in the wall. This one was different from the crawlspace upstairs, no obvious boards, just a thin line in the stone itself. She crossed to him, running her hand along the seam. The stones here were smoother, almost polished. When she pressed her palm flat against them, the surface was icy cold. Harris joined them, crouching low. "This isn't natural. Someone cut this in." "Recently," she said. "The dust pattern's different. And smell that." The air leaking through the seam carried a stronger scent now, damp, stale, with an undercurrent of something that made her stomach turn. Rook pawed at the base, claws scraping against stone. The sound was sharp, unnatural. They searched for a latch or mechanism, but the seam refused to give. Harris stepped back, scanning the edges with his beam. "Might open from the other side." "That means someone's using it," she replied. Her light caught on something in the dirt near the seam, small, scattered indentations. She crouched, brushing the soil aside with her glove. They weren't animal prints. They were shoe prints. Small ones. "Molly size," she murmured. The prints were uneven, as though she'd been standing here for a long time or shifting her weight nervously. They led toward the wall and stopped. Harris's jaw tightened. If these are fresh, she could still be. A sound cut him off. It was faint, almost lost in the cold air, a soft, deliberate tap from the other side of the seam. Rook froze, head cocked, ears forward. They held still, listening. The tap came again, this time followed by the faintest scrape, like fingernails dragging lightly over stone. Her pulse spiked. She crouched closer to the seam, lowering her voice. "Molly?" Silence. Then, so soft she almost thought she imagined it, came a whisper, "He's here." The voice was high and small, a child's. She jerked her gaze to Harris. His eyes were wide, his flashlight beam cutting back to the seam. Rook pressed his nose harder against the gap, letting out a low, rumbling growl. The whisper came again, a little clearer this time. "Don't let him find me." Her throat went dry. "We need to get this open. Now." Harris already had the pry bar in hand, wedging it into the narrowest point of the seam. The metal clanged softly against the stone. He pushed hard, the sound of strained wood and grinding rock filling the basement. From the other side, a sharp, heavy thud slammed against the wall, rattling the stones. Rook barked, this time loud and sharp. His entire body went rigid, tail stiff, teeth bared toward the seam. Harris gritted his teeth and shoved the bar deeper. "Something's holding it shut." Another thud came from the other side, louder, closer, followed by the rapid scuffle of movement. "Molly," she shouted into the seam. "Step back. Step away from the wall." There was no answer, just the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into darkness. Rook's growl deepened, a warning pulled from somewhere primal. Harris gave one last heave, the stone shifting just enough to release a sharp hiss of colder air. But before they could widen the opening, the sound of a latch sliding into place echoed from the other side. The hidden door was locked. The clunk of the latch echoed like a full stop in the cold, still air. Harris kept his hands braced against the stone as if sheer force might make it give, but the scene didn't move. She stepped back, her flashlight beam darting along the wall. There has to be another access point. No one builds a hidden room with one entrance. Rook circled once, nose sweeping the dirt floor in quick, deliberate arcs. He paused at the far corner, head snapping up, then moved along the wall with slow, calculated steps. His tail was stiff, each muscle in his body strung tight. Harris straightened, frustration edging his voice. "We're wasting time." If that was Molly. It was Molly, she cut in. And she's not alone. The memory of the whisper clung to her, "Don't let him find me." It hadn't been panicked, it had been measured, the way someone speaks when they've already learned panic doesn't help. Rook stopped at a section where the stonework met rotting wooden planks. The boards here weren't part of the structural beams, they were nailed over the stone, as if sealing something behind. His nose pressed hard against them, his breathing fast. She crossed quickly, tapping the planks with the back of her knuckles. The sound was hollow. Harris was already fishing out the pry bar. "Stand back." The first strike sent splinters into the air, the wood breaking away with surprising ease. It hadn't been reinforced like the stone door. Another strike, another groan of nails tearing free. The last board dropped to the dirt with a muted thud, revealing a narrow passage beyond. It was barely wide enough for one person to fit through at a time, the ceiling low, the floor uneven and damp. Rook shoved his head in first, sniffing deep. Then he glanced back at her, eyes locked on hers, a silent question. "Go," she said. The K9 moved in, his body sliding into the shadows without hesitation. She followed immediately, Harris close behind. The air in the passage was different, thicker, heavier, with a strong undercurrent of mold. The walls closed in so tightly she could feel her shoulders brushing against damp stone. Every few steps, her flashlight beam caught old wooden supports, warped with age, some slick with water from leaks overhead. The sound of dripping was louder here, more erratic. They moved in silence for nearly 20 feet before the passage began to curve. Rook slowed, head tilting as he listened to something ahead. She froze, holding up a hand to signal Harris to stop. From somewhere deeper in the dark came a muffled voice. Too low to make out words, but unmistakably male. The tone was casual. Almost conversational. Then a higher voice, "Molly." Softer. Closer to the cadence of answering questions than screaming for help. Her stomach tightened. "He's talking to her," she whispered. Rook's ears were forward, every muscle primed. They crept forward another few steps, the voices growing a fraction clearer. The man's tone stayed calm, but there was something in it that made the skin along her arms prickle, a false warmth, stretched too thin over something darker. Molly's responses were short. One word. Sometimes two. The passage ended abruptly at another wall of planks. Light leaked through narrow gaps between them, a dim, flickering glow, like from a candle or a weak bulb. She crouched, peering through one of the slats. On the other side was a cramped, low-ceilinged chamber. The floor was bare earth. Against one wall sat a small cot, covered with a thin blanket. Molly was on it, knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. A man sat on a wooden stool across from her. His back was to the planks, but even from this angle she could see the way his shoulders hunched forward, elbows resting on his knees. He leaned in slightly as he spoke, his hands moving in small, deliberate gestures. She couldn't make out the exact words, but she caught fragments. "Safe here, can't go back, you know that." Molly's eyes weren't on him. They were fixed somewhere to the side, directly at the plank wall where Rook was now crouched low, watching her through the gap. The moment she spotted him, her expression changed, just a flicker, but enough to say help is here. The man noticed the shift and turned his head slightly, but before his gaze could follow hers, Rook moved his head out of sight. She leaned close to Harris. "We take him now." Harris shook his head slightly. "We don't know if there's another exit in there. If he bolts, then Rook runs him down." They didn't get the chance to plan further. The man stood suddenly, the stool scraping against the dirt. He walked toward the far wall, disappearing out of sight, maybe to fetch something. Molly glanced at the plank wall again, this time her lips moving silently. 2 words. "Hurry up." She didn't wait. She slipped the pry bar from Harris's belt, wedging it into the gap between the planks. The nails resisted, squealing faintly as they bent. Rook stayed absolutely still, eyes on Molly. One board gave way, swinging inward with a crack. The sound was enough. From somewhere out of sight, the man's voice called sharply, "Molly?" Her blood ran cold at the sudden change in tone. Gone was the false warmth, replaced by something sharp-edged. Harris shoved another plank loose. "Go, go!" Rook lunged through the opening before the board even hit the ground. His nails tore at the dirt, his body a black streak across the chamber. From the far side, the man stepped back into view, and froze. The man's body locked the instant he saw Rook burst through the broken planks. For a fraction of a second, his hands twitched, not toward a weapon, but in that instinctive motion of someone realizing they've just lost control of the room. Rook didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply closed the distance between them in a blur, planting himself between the man and Molly's cot, head low, eyes locked upward in a steady, unblinking stare. "Don't move," she said sharply, stepping through the opening, her flashlight beam blinding the man for an instant. Harris was right behind her, weapon drawn but angled low. The man squinted against the light, raising one hand halfway. "You can't just..." "Step back," she cut in. "Now." He didn't. Instead, his gaze flicked toward Molly. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Rook caught it. The dog's head shifted a fraction to block the line of sight completely, his stance widening. "I said step back," she repeated, voice harder this time. The man finally took a slow step away from the cot. His clothes were worn, his boots caked with dirt. His hair hung unevenly, like it had been cut in a hurry with a dull blade. But it was his eyes that unsettled her, pale, darting, but not in panic. Calculating. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, his tone smooth again. "I was keeping her safe." Molly's voice cut through the stale air, small but firm. No, he wasn't. That was enough for her. She moved in closer, keeping herself between Molly and the man. "Harris, get her out." Harris stepped forward, motioning Molly toward the gap in the planks. She hesitated for half a heartbeat, glancing at Rook, then slipped past Harris into the narrow passage. The man's eyes tracked her every step. Rook moved with her, never turning his back on him. When Molly disappeared into the tunnel, the dog stopped at the opening, his head angled just enough to keep both the man and the passage in his peripheral vision. "You've got no idea what's out there," the man said. "She can't go back." "Neither can you," she replied. He took another step back, but it wasn't surrender. She recognized the subtle coil in his movements, like he was aligning himself with something in the room. Her flashlight beam swept briefly and caught the edge of an old wooden crate near the far wall. Before she could move, his hand shot toward it. "Rook!" The canine lunged, his bark exploding in the small space like a gunshot. The man froze mid-reach, his hands instinctively lifting to guard his face. Rook didn't bite, he didn't have to. The deep, rumbling growl that followed was enough to hold him in place. "Hands where I can see them," she ordered. He obeyed slowly, his gaze locked on the dog. "You don't understand." He's coming. Who? The man didn't answer. His chest rose and fell faster now, but not from fear, it was anticipation, like he was waiting for something to happen. From the tunnel behind her came Harris's voice, "We need to move. Now." She kept her focus on the man. "You're going first." His pale eyes flicked toward the tunnel. "No," he said simply. "I'm not going out there." "You don't have a choice." The air shifted then, faint, but enough for her to notice. A draft curled in from somewhere unseen, carrying with it a smell that made the hair along her neck stand on end. It wasn't the damp earth scent of the basement. This was sharper. Acrid. The man's lips curved into the faintest smile. "He's here." Rook's head snapped toward the far wall, his ears pricking. A low growl vibrated in his chest, deeper than before. She stepped closer to the man, shoving him toward the tunnel. "Move." He resisted, planting his boots hard in the dirt. "You'll regret it." "I'm done talking," she snapped, drawing her sidearm. That did it. He moved, slow and reluctant, into the tunnel, Rook pressing close enough behind that the man's every step was monitored. They emerged into the larger passage where Harris stood with Molly tucked close behind him. She was pale, eyes wide, but she hadn't let go of Rook's harness when he brushed past to rejoin her. "What about the far end?" Harris asked. "Didn't see it," she replied. "We're sealing this and calling it in." Before Harris could respond, a sound drifted from the chamber they'd just left, a long, low creak, like wood under strain. Then a sharper crack. The man's expression shifted instantly to something that looked almost like triumph. "What is that?" Harris demanded. The man's voice was calm again. "You'll see." She didn't wait to find out. "Move faster." They pushed him toward the basement entrance, Molly ahead of Harris, Rook taking up the rear again. But the air was different now, heavier, the temperature dropping with each step. From behind them came another sound. This one wasn't structural. It was rhythmic. Slow. Footsteps. Molly heard it too. She froze mid-step, turning her head toward the dark end of the passage. Her voice was barely a whisper. "That's him." The sound was deliberate, each step landing with the weight of someone who wasn't in a hurry, but also wasn't stopping. It carried through the narrow tunnel in a way that made it impossible to judge the exact distance, but the rhythm was steady. Rook's ears angled sharply toward the noise, his body lowering slightly, muscles taut. He didn't bark this time. Instead, his lips pulled back just enough to show teeth, a low, vibrating growl building in his chest. "Keep moving," she ordered, pushing the man ahead of her. Harris gripped Molly's shoulder, guiding her forward. "Eyes ahead, kid." But Molly didn't look ahead. Her gaze stayed locked on the darkness behind them. "It's him," she whispered again, more certain this time. The man chuckled softly, and it was the sound more than anything else that made her skin crawl. "Told you," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "Shut up," she said flatly. The footsteps grew louder, the scrape of a boot sole catching on the uneven ground. The sound stopped for a moment, and in the pause, the silence was deafening. Even the dripping water they'd heard earlier seemed to vanish. Then, from the dark, came a single, low exhale, too heavy to be Molly's, too close to be ignored. Rook surged forward a half step, growl deepening. "Move," she barked, her voice ricocheting off the damp walls. They quickened their pace, the tunnel narrowing again. The man stumbled once, catching himself on the rough stone. Harris and Molly squeezed through the tight space, emerging back into the main basement chamber where the ladder loomed ahead. She shoved the man toward Harris. "Get them up." Harris grabbed Molly first, boosting her onto the ladder. Her small hands clutched the rungs, climbing quickly despite the tremor in her movements. Harris followed close behind, one hand steadying her. The man lingered at the base of the ladder, eyes flicking toward the passage they'd just exited. "If you see him, you're next," she snapped, yanking him toward the rungs. He climbed slowly, as if every step was a choice he didn't want to make. Rook stayed planted between her and the passage entrance, his head low, eyes fixed on the darkness. The growl in his chest had turned into something steadier now, not a warning, but a promise. She glanced over her shoulder. "Up, Rook." He didn't move. "Rook." That's when she saw it, movement in the black. Just a shadow at first, darker than the rest, gliding toward the edge of the weak light bleeding in from the basement. The footsteps returned, slower now, as if the owner knew they had no reason to rush. The shape was tall, broader than the man they'd found with Molly. She couldn't see a face, the light refused to touch it. Rook took a step forward. "No," she hissed, snapping her fingers. "With me." The figure stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the soft drip of water far in the distance. Then, from that shadowed shape, came a sound so quiet she almost thought she imagined it, the faint rasp of a voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The words weren't loud, but they carried every syllable sharp, deliberate. Her throat tightened, but she kept her weapon trained on the passage. "Up, Rook." "Now." This time, Rook obeyed. He backed toward the ladder, his gaze never leaving the shadow. He climbed quickly, nails scraping on the wood, and she followed, her flashlight beam fixed on the dark until the moment she stepped onto the first rung. The shape didn't move. She climbed fast, her boots finding the worn ladder rungs automatically. The cold intensified as she rose, like the air itself was following them upward. Harris reached down from the basement opening, grabbing Molly under the arms and pulling her the last few feet. The man was already off to the side, hands bound with a zip tie from Harris's belt. She emerged last, hauling herself into the basement and immediately pulling the hatch closed. The latch clicked into place, the sound too small to feel like real security. They all stood still for a moment, the only sound their breathing. Molly clung to Rook's harness, pressing her face into the thick fur at his neck. The dog stood like a sentinel, body blocking her from the hatch. The man broke the silence first. "You can't keep him out." "Not if he wants in." Harris shot him a look that could have cut through stone. "Shut your mouth." She stepped closer to Molly, crouching to meet her eyes. "You're safe now." Molly shook her head. "Not here." Before she could ask where, something hit the underside of the hatch, a single, sharp impact that rattled the boards beneath their feet. Rook's bark exploded into the air, so loud and sudden it made everyone flinch. He lunged at the hatch, claws raking the wood. Then another hit came. And another. Slow. Steady. The man smiled faintly. "Told you." The blows were methodical now, each one spaced just far enough apart to let the sound settle before the next struck. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't desperate. Whoever was down there knew exactly what they were doing. Rook stayed pressed against the hatch, his body vibrating with the force of his barking. Molly crouched behind him, her small hands gripping the base of his harness like she thought holding on might keep him from leaving. Harris was already moving. "We're not staying down here." "Stairs." "Now." The basement's narrow wooden steps groaned under their boots as they ascended. The air got a fraction warmer the higher they climbed, but the cold from below seemed to cling to them like it didn't want to let go. At the top, Harris shouldered open the heavy door to the ground floor. It gave with a reluctant creak, revealing the dimly lit living room above. The drawn curtains let in no natural light, the only illumination came from a single bare bulb hanging over a corner table. "Go," Harris said, ushering Molly through first. She hesitated, looking back toward the hatch. "He's not going to stop." "You let us worry about that," she told her, guiding her forward. The man with the zip-tied wrists stepped into the room last, his eyes scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling, as though cataloging something only he understood. Then came another sound, faint but unmistakable, from somewhere beneath the floorboards. Not the sharp impact of before. This was softer. Lighter. Footsteps. Harris froze. That's not possible. The hatches. The man smirked, cutting him off. Doors don't matter to him. Before Harris could snap back, Rook moved. He broke from Molly's side, head low, trotting toward the far wall. His nails clicked against the warped floorboards, each sound sharp in the otherwise still room. He stopped at the base of a tall wooden cabinet, his nose pressed to the narrow seam where it met the wall. She approached, running her flashlight beam along the edges. The cabinet wasn't flush with the floor, there was a thin gap at the bottom, just enough for air to pass through. The smell coming from that gap hit her immediately, cold earth and that same acrid undertone from the tunnel. "Help me move it," she said to Harris. They gripped the cabinet on either side and heaved. It resisted for a second before sliding with a scraping groan across the uneven floor. Dust and small wood splinters rained down from its top as it revealed what was behind it, another door. This one wasn't like the others. It was newer. Solid steel, with a single heavy latch. Molly's voice was a whisper. "That's where he comes in." Harris stepped forward, testing the latch. "Locked from this side." "Leave it locked," she said immediately. But before Harris could respond, the sound from below changed again, the footsteps stopped, replaced by a slow, dragging scrape along the metal itself. The noise crawled up the door in measured increments, the steel groaning faintly under the pressure. Rook's body stiffened. His bark this time was short, sharp, almost like a command to everyone else in the room to stay back. The man laughed under his breath. "He knows you're here." Her patience snapped. "Sit down and shut up before I make you." He raised his bound hands slightly in a mock surrender but didn't wipe the grin off his face. Harris backed toward the front door. "We're getting her out of here. If he wants to follow, let him come out into the open." They moved quickly, Rook falling in beside Molly again as Harris unlatched the front door. The hinges screamed in protest as it opened, letting in the gray wash of late afternoon light. The air outside was damp, heavy with the smell of rain. The house stood alone on its lot, surrounded by tall, skeletal trees whose bare branches scraped lightly against each other in the wind. They stepped onto the rotting porch, the boards sagging beneath their weight. Rook paused at the top of the steps, his head swiveling back toward the interior. Then, from inside the house, came the sound of the steel latch shifting. Harris didn't wait. "Move!" They went down the steps fast, the ground sucking at their boots with patches of wet mud. Harris led them toward the narrow dirt track that passed for a driveway, the patrol SUV parked halfway down. Halfway there, Molly stopped dead. She was looking not at the house, but at the tree line beyond the driveway. He was there. Tall. Still. The same shape from the tunnel, unmoving, just watching. No details. No face. Just an absence of light where a man should be. Rook saw him next. The dog's bark split the air, echoing through the empty woods. He surged forward, but her hand shot to his harness, holding him in place. "Get her in the car," she shouted to Harris. But when she turned back to the trees, the figure was gone. The space where the figure had stood felt wrong, like the air itself hadn't settled yet, as if it was still shaped around something that had just been there. "Get in the car," she snapped again, her voice sharper this time. Harris didn't argue. He guided Molly toward the SUV, one hand hovering protectively over her head as he opened the rear passenger door. Rook didn't move until Molly's legs disappeared into the back seat, and even then, his head kept swiveling toward the tree-line. The bound man lingered at the porch steps, looking not at the vehicle but toward the house. "You won't get far," he said quietly, almost conversational. She walked back to him, hand closing firmly on his arm. "You're coming too." He didn't resist, but the smirk never left his face. They reached the SUV, and Harris moved to secure him in the rear beside Molly, separating them with a clear warning, "You talk to her, I shut you up." The man only leaned back, closing his eyes like he was settling in for a drive he'd been waiting for. She took the driver's seat, Harris sliding into the passenger side. Rook sat rigidly between the front seats, his gaze locked out the windshield, nose twitching against the glass. The dirt road was narrow, rutted from years of neglect. She kept her speed steady, eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirror. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when Molly spoke. "He's following us." Her eyes darted to the rear view. The figure was back. At first, it seemed too far to be moving so fast, but each time the SUV jolted over a rut, he seemed closer in the next glance. No running. No lunging. Just that same steady walk, each step carrying him farther than it should. Harris turned in his seat. "What the hell?" The man in the back chuckled softly. "You can't outrun him. Doesn't work that way." "Shut up," Harris snapped. She pressed harder on the accelerator, the SUV rattling over the uneven track. The figure didn't blur into the distance the way he should have. If anything, the space between them seemed to bend, keeping him tethered to them. Rook's growl deepened, his body lowering slightly as if preparing to leap straight through the glass. The trees thinned ahead, giving way to a stretch of open ground where the dirt track met the main road. She didn't slow. They hit the asphalt with a jolt, the tires squealing briefly before gripping. She took a sharp right, the dense tree line now running parallel to the road. The figure moved with them. Still on the forest side. Still keeping pace. Molly's voice was barely audible. "He doesn't like roads." The man's smile widened. "Not his place. But he'll wait." Harris shot him a glare that could have burned through steel, but the man didn't flinch. They drove another mile before the treeline fell away completely, replaced by open fields. The figure didn't appear at the edge anymore. Rook's ears twitched, but his growl faded. Molly finally released a breath, though her small hands stayed twisted in the fabric of his harness. She glanced up at them. "We can't go home." "Why not?" Harris asked gently, though his voice was still tight. "He knows where I live." Silence filled the car for a few long seconds. The man in the back shifted slightly, the zip tie creaking. "You're not taking her anywhere safe if you don't understand what he is." She gripped the wheel tighter. "You're not talking." But the man didn't stop. "He's not after all of you. Just her. Always has been." Molly flinched at that, curling closer to Rook. The dog pressed his head gently into her side, the low rumble in his chest softening but never disappearing. Harris broke the silence. "We're going to the station. Lockdown, secure room. If this guy's full of it, he can explain it to a judge." The man smiled faintly, eyes still closed. "Won't make a difference." They reached the outskirts of town, the roads widening and streetlights beginning to break through the gray. She felt some of the tension in her shoulders ease, but only slightly. As they pulled into the station lot, Rook suddenly stood, his tail stiff, head whipping toward the rear of the lot. She followed his gaze. At the far edge of the property, just where the asphalt met the shadow of the last row of trees, the figure stood. Unmoving. Watching. For a moment, nobody moved. The patrol SUV idled in the lot, its engine low and steady, but inside the vehicle the air was tight enough to choke on. Rook stood motionless between the seats, his entire body aimed at the figure at the tree line. The dog's hackles were up, ears forward, tail stiff, every muscle tuned to a single point. Molly was the first to speak, her voice a brittle whisper. "He's not supposed to be here." The man in the back seat opened his eyes. "You think there's a place he's not supposed to be?" She ignored him. "Harris, "Get them inside," she said, already unbuckling. Harris got out first, scanning the lot. His hand rested on the grip of his sidearm, but he didn't draw it yet. He opened the rear door on Molly's side, offering her a hand. She didn't move until Rook stepped down first, planting himself at her side. The girl followed immediately, one hand never leaving the harness strap. The man climbed out last, moving slowly as if he had all the time in the world. Harris kept a firm grip on his arm, steering him toward the entrance. She glanced once more at the figure. He hadn't moved. The distance between them was unchanged, but it felt as though the gap was less about space and more about permission. The front doors of the station opened automatically as they approached, the warm air inside a sharp contrast to the damp chill outside. The receptionist at the front desk stood, eyes darting between the child, the bound man, and the dog. "Interview room 2, she said without explanation, already reaching for the phone. They moved quickly down the hall. The man was placed in a chair in the corner of the interview room, his wrists still secured. Molly sat at the small table, Rook settling into position between her and the door. She took Harris aside, just out of earshot. "We need to get someone on the cameras. Every angle outside. If he's still there." A sudden bang from the front of the building cut her off. It wasn't loud enough to be a gunshot, but it was deliberate, the kind of sound made to be noticed. Harris's hand was on his weapon in an instant. "Stay here," he said, and moved toward the sound. She stayed just long enough to meet Molly's eyes. "Don't open that door for anyone but me." The girl nodded once, clutching Rook's harness tighter. She followed Harris down the hall to the lobby. The receptionist was gone. The front doors were closed, but the glass panes in each reflected the fluorescent lights inside, and something else. A shape. Right outside. She froze. The figure was closer now, standing directly at the edge of the door's threshold. No movement. No sound. But the sense of pressure in the air was heavier, like every second it stood there pushed the oxygen out of the room. Harris reached for the door lock, but she caught his wrist. "Don't." They both turned as a muffled bark echoed from down the hall. "Rook." Then came Molly's scream. They ran. Harris reached the interview room first, shoving the door open. The man was still in the chair, but he was leaning forward now, smiling wider than she'd seen before. Molly was pressed against the far corner, Rook between her and the man, but not looking at him. The dog's gaze was fixed on the wall. Not the door. Not the window. The wall. A faint scraping sound came from inside it, like something dragging along the studs. Then, without warning, a single hand pressed through the drywall from the other side, pale, impossibly long fingers curling into the room. Harris swore, drawing his weapon. The man laughed quietly. "Told you. Doesn't need doors." The hand withdrew just as suddenly as it appeared, leaving only a ragged hole. Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Molly's breathing slowed slightly, though her eyes stayed fixed on the hole. "He's gone," she whispered. The man shook his head, that faint smirk never fading. "Not gone. Just waiting."